Right, good morning, everybody. This morning, I don't want to talk about the future as much as the political, cultural context within which the present moment has arisen. And I want to dig a little bit deep, so I'll be going through a lot of historical material to build up the argument about what is the driving force of the culture wars. And the reason why this is a very difficult discussion for me is because whenever you talk about the culture war, there's always people often say, what culture war? There really isn't a culture war. And you'll find that most of the books written about the culture war in America in the 1970s, 1980s, they always argue that it's exaggerated. You know, on balance, most Americans agree with each other on fundamentals. And it's only a few nutters on the margins who insist that there's a polarized cultural environment being created. And what's very interesting is that the discussion around the war of cultures, the conflicts, is always very, very implicit. So for example, when conservatives attack the other side and denounce political correctness, they will then say, what is political correctness? It doesn't really exist. There is no such thing. I remember until very recently, if you talked about identity politics, they would say, what identity politics? This is an invention of some people to undermine us. And it's only very recently that people who believe in identity politics actually acknowledge that that's what they're into and they celebrate it. So it's a very kind of recent development. And the most frustrating thing about the discussion on the culture war is that what you're up against is rarely explicit and never comes across as a system of ideas. In many ways, it is a silent culture war where the ideology that's driving it often has an implicit form. It's not something that comes across as an ideology or a system of ideas. It's just something that is tacitly engaged with, something that people take for granted. And it almost has this kind of secret-like character to it. And what's important about the culture war is if you look at when it began in the current one, it used to be about issues like the environment, it used to be about the family, it used to be about abortion, it used to be all these old school ideals. You know, if you look at the 70s, the very first moment when it begins to emerge, it was quite comprehensible. You know, the conservatives were for family values. The opposite side didn't like the family very much, or argued that there are 1.5 million types of families. There's no point talking about a nuclear family. Who would have imagined 20 years ago or 10 years ago that in the 21st century, this present moment, the big debates about culture in the culture wars would be about white supremacy? I mean, where did white supremacy come from? And how did everything that white people do become an act of supremacy? You know, who made that up? And who would have imagined 10 years ago or 15 years ago that we would have massive debates, fantastic debates, about what is a man and what is a woman, right? That it's so passé and it's so arbitrary to insist on these two things, you know, but when in the world we live in, actually, it's so fluid that these distinctions are, if anything, are kind of oppressive and discriminatory. I mean, who would have imagined 15, 20 years ago that, in fact, everything becomes fluid? That people talk about the stupidity of binary thinking. You know, where you get to the point where any form of binary, right and wrong, good and bad, men and women, animals or humans, private and public, all those things are really an invention. A meaningless invention that has some kind of oppressive character to it. So what we're seeing here is a very interesting development. And one of the things that has occurred that I've never seen explained properly is how did it come about that behind the scenes, year in and year out, what used to be in the 1960s the counterculture gradually mutates into a hegemonic culture. But it's no longer the same culture because at least the counterculture in the 60s had some good bits in it. Whereas what becomes the hegemonic force in institutions, education, in private businesses, in corporations, who would have imagined that those values and those attitudes would then come to prevail? And at the same time, the attitudes and the values that used to try to resist the counterculture have more or less disintegrated. And that's fantastic when you think about it, that there is no institution within Western societies that even makes the slightest pretense of standing up for those views. The Conservative Party is unrecognizable. It's got nothing in common with the Conservative Party of the 1950s. The churches, are now made up of guitar-singing priests who basically are so proud and boast about the fact that they're Catholic, but they would never make the slightest attempt to learn Latin. It's such an irrelevant thing. All these institutions, even the most conservative of conservative institutions, have kind of rolled over and have adapted and to some extent have given way to something that has no name. I mean, it's got no explicit name to it. It's not like, anarchism or socialism or communism or anything like that. It's got no clear name to it. In fact, the people who are supporting these changes swear, and they probably are genuine, that they don't really understand why they're seen as members of a particular cultural group with particular political and cultural ambitions. I also think it's very important to get away from accounts that see this as principally an American phenomenon. It is true that almost everything horrible that has developed in the last 30 or 40 years begins in America. That is undoubtedly the case. But the actual speed with which these things are imported into other Western societies is truly fantastic. It's almost like, you hear about what's happening in Los Angeles, 2 months ago, and next morning you wake up and you begin to realize that it's already making its presence known within your society. So we're talking about global phenomenon that are much more recognizable. For example, the discussion on white supremacy is much more recognizable in America, but you know that already in Britain and other European societies, discussions about how white supremacy is dominating our world is cropping up and becoming increasingly used in everyday kind of conversations. One of the reasons why the culture war is difficult to grasp is that it's different than any other culture wars in the past, or at least conflicts over culture. If you go back in history, you'll find that, for example, there was a culture war between the Jews and the Greeks. The Jews really didn't like the influence that Greek philosophy exercised on young people, particularly in places like Alexandria. You had a conflict of culture between the Romans and the Greeks. Cicero didn't really want the Romans to kind of owe their debts to Greek philosophy either. You had culture wars during the Reformation. You had culture wars, as Angus was saying earlier on, in Germany in the 19th century. All these culture wars are different than now in that they weren't principally cultural. The culture was not the main driving force. They were really sublimated expressions of other kinds of conflict. So in the case of the Reformation, there was one doctrine, Protestantism, against another doctrine, Catholicism. It was very, very clear what the ideas were really all about. If you looked at the cultural conflicts in France in the 19th century, it was the Catholic Church versus Republican secular thinking about what kind of education would dominate schools in those societies. Same thing in the Kulturkampf in Germany. It was very, very clear what these were about. But all these conflicts were often about secular political interests. So in the case of Germany, it was about German unification. In the case of France, it was about what does it mean to be French. In the case of the Reformation, it was the princes versus the universal church, or the kings, that emperors that tried to kind of personify this universal church. All very different than now, because now we haven't got these kind of doctrinal disputes. Just to make a long story short, if there's one thing that comes out of this lecture that maybe you want to remember, I think one of the principal features of culture war, which comes up in every single debate and every single discussion is this impulse, this psychological, social, political impulse to detach ourselves as human beings from our past. It's continually an attempt to pathologize everything that human beings done in the past. That's a no-go area, and distance ourselves as much as possible. And I'll try to explain what that means and how that works in relation to a number of different kind of debates. Our culture war begins in an embryonic form after First World War. I think the First World War is the beginning of a long protracted process that we're seeing now. It was in the First World War that something very important happened. It was a war that nobody actually won. Perhaps America did for a short period of time. But the consequence of that war was that the Western societies and the elites of the West begin to have doubts about who they were, begin to lose confidence in the values into which they were socialized, were no longer able to tell their children and their grandchildren with conviction that this is what we're about. And you'll find that decade after decade after decade, education changes. It becomes increasingly a reaction to what has gone on beforehand. You find that child rearing changes in a very fundamental way. Children are brought up into values that are almost the polar opposite to what has gone on beforehand. You find that suddenly everything looks really bad about the past, that the past becomes a dark place. And certainly after the Second World War, when you have this horrible experience, a lot of people draw the conclusion that what happened in the Second World War, Nazism and the concentration camp, weren't just simply horrible developments, but they were the inevitable consequence of Western culture, that somehow, the Reformation and the Enlightenment and science and rationality inevitably lead to Auschwitz. That's the kind of simplistic way in which many of these ideals were kind of posed. And I think that kind of loss of confidence in Western values is really quite important. And it's actually quite shocking that most people who discuss this thing haven't really picked up on this. And in many respects, I think what happens is that just as the Western elites initially find it very difficult to acknowledge that they no longer believe in what they're about, so too the reaction to it hasn't really got very much of a name, hasn't got a real clarity to it. There's a very interesting exchange that takes place in 1970, which really sums up to me like a critical point. In 1970, you have a discussion between Daniel Moynihan and Richard Nixon. He's the president at that point. You all know Nixon, seen the film. And Moynihan was one of the most intelligent, conservative-minded. He was actually a Democrat to begin with, but was drawn towards conservatism, intellectual and policymaker of the time. And Daniel Moynihan writes a memorandum to Nixon, and this is what he says. No doubt, there's a struggle going on in this country of the kind the Germans used to call a Kulturkampf. The adversary culture, which dominates all channels of information, transfer and opinion formation, has never been stronger. And as best as I can tell, it has come near silencing the representatives of traditional America. So what he's really saying is that there is what he calls adversarial culture. That's the way they named it. This thing that has got no name used to be called either the counterculture by its supporters and adversarial culture by its opponents. So there's this adversarial culture that has become so influential that it dominates all institutions of communication. In other words, it dominates the media and cultural production. And the most important point that he makes, which really wasn't picked up on all that well is that he has come near silencing the representatives of traditional America. Silencing. And I think that one of the things that we need to take away from this memorandum is that this capacity to silence your opponents has become stronger and stronger and stronger. In other words, one of the things that we find in the cultural conflict is that that side has become remarkably successful in silencing those people who feel uneasy with what's really going on. That's why these Muslim parents that Angus talked about break the norm, because they haven't been educated into proper Western values, right? They still believe that, if they get worried about what their children are learning, they have a right to shout and yell, even if they risk being denounced as homophobes, right? They are not like us, or normal people who are too embarrassed to say what we think, right? They're different. And I think this silencing element is something you see most strikingly in universities, but you see that everywhere, where there are certain things, certain words you cannot say, certain expressions you cannot use, and you cannot really confidently voice your intuition and your instinct. That's not something that is really available to you. And that's something that in this discussion and in the next couple of days we should think about, how we give people back their voice. Because it's not just simply people sitting in this room who might have reservations about what's going on. There's a lot of other people there who lack a voice at the moment in terms of being able to have the confidence. And I think the reason why they haven't got the confidence is because for generations and generations and generations, their elites and their cultural institutions have really lost the confidence, the ability to stand up for anything that remotely links them to where they come from. There isn't really any of that going on. Conceptually, there are two phases to the current culture war, the one that we're going through. The first is from 1914 and 1970, but particularly the 1950s and the 1960s. In this period, in the 1950s, 60s, what we see is the loss of belief of the bourgeoisie, which opens the door to what will be known as the counterculture, who then gain a spectacular amount of ascendancy in the United States. So what that tells us is that this cultural conflict is something that is internal to Western capitalism. It doesn't come from the outside. It's not an importation from Asia or from Mars. It's something that is internal to the way that Western capitalism develops. And I think in the first instance, it is an expression of capitalism's inability to generate moral authority and to be able to legitimate itself. In the second instance, this problem is a product of a vain attempt to bypass this problem by distancing society from the past and the moral outlook that provided capitalism with sustenance in the centuries beforehand. When I look back upon its history, just to be very brief because we haven't got time, this loss of confidence and this attempt to detach yourself from the past finds its first most striking expression in what's called American progressivism, which is a kind of technocratic social engineering ambition that takes off in the United States in the late 19th, early 20th century, and then is later in the 60s reinforced by counter-cultural anti-Enlightenment impulses, which combine a disposition towards particularism, cultural particularism, and emotionalism, which is why I would say that the cultural, what's called the cultural turn, something I'm talking about tomorrow, is actually as much a culture as a psychological turn. I think you'll find that the emotionalist aspects becomes very, very important. And what's important about this reaction to capitalist ideals is it's very different than previous anti-materialist rebellions. It's not like the Bohemians or the Romantics who are against materialism or against consumerism. This is really a questioning of the moral underpinnings of society. So that's, in a sense, is quite important. Now, until the 1960s, 1970s, most commentators didn't really pick up on this. And the reason for that is because they were entirely obsessed by the political and ideological conflicts that were going on in the Cold War. In the eyes of most people, the conflict since the First World War was communism versus capitalism, Russia versus America. And obviously, that was the big international sort of conflict that people were focused on. But what was really not noticed is that behind the scenes, while these big ideological Cold War conflicts were being fought out, something else was going on under the surface. And I think it's interesting that when the new culture war begins to emerge in the 1960s, it is associated in the eyes of conservatives with the new left. This is a left-wing thing that's happening. It's a left wing that's using underhanded methods to undermine our way of life. As it happens, even today, people use this idiotic expression of cultural Marxism. That is, the cultural Marxists in the universities are doing this, not realizing there is no such thing as cultural Marxists, and cultural Marxist period are conspicuous by their absence in universities. So that wasn't really seen, and what they didn't really understand was that this new cultural movement that was emerging was as much against the left, the old left, as it was against the right. It was against any form of ideology or outlook that was either directly or indirectly linked to the Enlightenment or to the Reformation or to Christianity. Any of those things were seen as being almost like the cultural contrast to what was emerging. So basically what we have at this moment is a kind of movement that is corroding away at the cultural confidence of Western society, but it's doing it in a way that it's not aware of its intention or its dynamic. And in a sense, what's interesting about this period is that the rebellion of the 60s is not really a rebellion, because what they're doing is they're kicking against an open door. There really isn't very much that's actually kind of opposing them at that time. The second phase of the culture war begins in the 1970s, and it goes on till today. And in the 1970s, what we see is, number one, the institutionalization of the counterculture, first in education, particularly in higher education, then in the public sector, and finally in the private sector. I think you have to realize that people talk about the university, what's going on, but you go work for Google or you work for any private company, and it's really no different. I mean, the same kind of, if you talk to any human resources person in Google, they're just as horrible as an administrator at a university. They got pretty much the same kind of values, kind of overall. And in this period, what we're seeing is the first attempt to kind of constitute, to create, to elaborate a kind of set of counter values. It's really in the 70s that you have the beginnings of that. And where gradually, bit by bit, they're gaining hegemony over society. I think in the 70s, you also see, unnoticed, the disappearance of Western values. It's in the 1970s that the term Western civilization mutates from something you're proud of to something you're embarrassed about. I mean, it's a very swift process that occurs at that particular stage in time. And until the 1960s, 70s, what you saw was the conflict between old-fashioned conservatism and this new movement. But what you have, in a sense, from that period onward is a much more broadening out of attacks on kind of, in a sense, a kind of foundational forms. In a sense, what we saw at this particular moment is a corrosion of Western civilization by forces that are internal to it. And I think that's very important to understand, that the conflict is something that is internal, is imminent, that's kind of contained within it. And what you're seeing is a moral collapse occurring, which leads to, and this I think today is most clearly seen in the debate on white supremacy, because I think what's interesting about the debate on white supremacy is that it's not simply about reversing the racial hierarchy. I mean, if you look at America, the discussion on white supremacy tries to almost say, well, the white are the bad and black people are the good. It's a complete kind of reversal of racial hierarchy. But it's also an attempt, and this is what's original about it at this stage, an attempt to create a new racial discourse where you basically create a new kind of racialization project that racializes everything. And in the course of doing that, what you do is you reverse the moral values. So, what is the personification of evil in the 21st century if you're an American university professor or an American guy working in Google? The personification of evil is not just white, but male, white male, and not just white male, but preferably a dead one, right? So the dead white male is actually an interesting personification project because by the dead is really important. I never used to understand why they go with, why not just white male? Why do they have to be dead white male? And the reason why they have to be dead is because our cultural heroes on that side spend so much of their time lecturing our ancestors, kind of criticizing people that can no longer answer back, detaching society from the past, that the dead white male becomes this almost spontaneously kind of developed kind of way in which evil can be personified and horrified. What is the precondition for the culture war? Well, I said, first of all, it's a loss of moral authority. It's what I suppose you can talk about is the depletion of moral capital, of capitalism. There's a very interesting article that Irving Kristol, who then became a neoconservative, wrote, where he basically makes a very simple point. He says, the moral depletion of capitalism leads to a legitimacy crisis. And he says this, and he's very much sad about it because obviously he's totally identifying with the capitalist system. He says, for well over 150 years now, social critics have been warning us that bourgeois society was living off the accumulated moral capital of traditional religion and traditional moral philosophy, and that once this capital was depleted, bourgeois society would find its legitimacy even more questionable. So the depletion of moral capital, I think, was absolutely crucial for the counterculture to become so clearly hegemonic. And it's interesting that this development, as you would expect, first crystallizes in literary culture and academia. There's a wonderful book which people should read if they're interested in literature. It's by Lionel Trilling, who's an extremely sensitive individual. He really picks up on cultural trends much better than anybody else in the 40s and the 1950s. And in 1965, he wrote a preface to a book called Beyond Culture. And this is what he says. Any historian of the modern age will take virtually for granted the adversary intention, the actual subversive intention that characterizes modern writing. He will perceive its clear purpose of detaching the reader from the habit of thought and feeling that the larger culture imposes, of giving him a ground and a vantage point from which to judge and condemn and perhaps revise the culture that has produced him. And I think that's true. If you know anything about literature, it's great. I mean, there's no reason why literature shouldn't be like that. But if you look at literature in the 30s and the 40s and the 50s, it's all about detaching the reader from the habits and thoughts and feeling of the larger culture. And he really kind of picks up on that, this kind of intellectual, literary kind of process. And of course, while he's writing, from a slightly different point of view, Jean-Paul Sartre says the same thing. Sartre wrote in 1949 that the writer gives society a guilty conscience. He is thereby in a state of perpetual antagonism towards the conservative forces which are maintaining the balance he tends to upset. Now, there's nothing wrong with writers trying to give society a guilty conscience. That's can be an honorable occupation, because sometimes society should have a guilty conscience about certain things. None of this would have been a problem, except for the fact that when Sartre was writing and when others were writing these books that were questioning everything to do with the cultural norms of society, the people that should have been defending those cultural norms were looking at their shoelaces. Right? They were embarrassed about it. They weren't fighting back. And I think that what you can see is that what begins in a sense, gains momentum. In the 1970s, what you have is a situation where the establishment in America, particularly, it begins there, becomes cynical about its own role. It makes fun of itself. It's in the 1970s that in America, and then later on in Britain, it takes a bit longer, the political class disintegrates and they turn into politicians. There's a big difference between a political class with a noblesse oblige, with a court, with a l'esprit de corps, and a bunch of politicians who are out for themselves, when nothing is binding them together. They've got no organic relationship to their own society, their own culture, or to their own past. And I think what you've got there is a political class that was still half-heartedly trying to defend something, but all they could do in the 70s and the 80s and the 90s was let rip at the intellectuals or the academics. This is the problem. In other words, they were letting rip at the messengers rather than actually what was going on as a bit of a problem. It's a very, that defensiveness is really well captured by Seymour Lipset, a political scientist in America, who actually in 1972, faced with attacks on their legitimacy from intellectuals and students, many in the governing elite exhibit a failure of nerve. The basic tensions of the contradictions within the system come from within the elite itself, from its own intellectual leaders, supported by large segments of its student children. I think that is obviously the case that kind of crosses the nerve. When I was struggling to understand the culture war, I tried to find a moment where it first crystallizes, where you can really see in embryo what's going to happen today. And I think the most interesting moment, something that people interpret very differently, was the McCarthy episode. McCarthy, the Cold War warrior, the anti-communist, there's loads of films made about McCarthy, about how he managed to banish people and what a powerful individual he was, and how he managed to virtually close down Hollywood. And he's like the prototype of the fascist right wing, I'm almost like Trump before Trump, right? But what people forget about McCarthy is that he never gained intellectual or cultural hegemony. McCarthy was able to scare a lot of people. He was able to fire a lot of producers and actors in Hollywood. But actually, the universities, academia, education remained completely immune from McCarthy's influence. And as Jeane Kirkpatrick wrote in the 1970s, and Jeane Kirkpatrick is as conservative as you get, she wrote, McCarthy was never able to gain the symbolic authority that he tried to wrest from the people that were on the other side. And what McCarthy tried to do, in a sense, was to force people in the United States to conform to his version of American values. And what he discovered was that rather than conforming to the values that he wanted, people just rebelled against it. So the McCarthy period, which is often seen as a triumph of the far right, actually revealed at a very, very early point that you cannot, through administrative and policing means, win the culture wars. These are far out in the realm of ideas, principally. And unless you're able to gain some kind of symbolic significance over the production of ideas, you're not going to get very far. That was in the 1950s. The permissive 60s that we talked about looked positively sober and positively conservative to the period that we're living in now. If you take your mind back, 60s, a lot of hippies and smoking dope and everything else, but that was, compared to the challenge to the basic fundamental values of our world, was far more restrained than the kind of stuff we're hearing in the 21st century. I think it's worth thinking about that because we often lose sight of that. So what are the issues at stake here in this culture war? I'm not going to discuss the obvious ones because you all know them, the family, marriage, sex, all these, abortion, all that stuff. They're old hat, so we're kind of quite familiar with them. I think it's much more important to understand the issues at stake as, first of all, focused around these lectures that are constantly delivered against our ancestors. That, I think, is the most self-revealing statements, the continuous attempt to rewrite the past, because it's in the rewriting the past that people actually write down what is the world they want to do. They're much braver in fighting against roads or in getting University College to fight against the eugenics people of 100 years ago than actually making a clear statement about where they are today. I think what they're really about is a distancing. It's a principally seen as a distancing process where you're distancing people from their communities, from their families, from their past, and all those things. It's a negative process of detaching people from their traditions, from a particular way of life. I think it's this negativity that prevents it until now of developing a more positive version of an alternative cultural kind of system. I've come to the conclusion that the most important battleground in this cultural conflict, something that only rears its head now and again, is sovereignty. And not just national sovereignty, but the sovereignty of the individual. I think almost all the hatred and all the attacks are very much directed against individual sovereignty. If you look at the hostility in America that's directed against the idea of autonomy, autonomy is a myth, individual autonomy is nonsensical, it's particularly nonsensical for minorities and for people who have suffered from various kinds of oppressions. You'll find that almost bit by bit, the conflict, the cultural conflict and the attacks move from the political to the pre-political sphere. It's all about the way we lead our lives. It's what you do, it's your lifestyle. It's what you do with other people. It's how you behave with other people. It's how you communicate with other people. I mean, concepts like microaggression, all these things, are very much about, in a sense, occupying or colonizing the private sphere. I think that's a lot of the battlegrounds is a self-conscious attempt to destroy the boundary between the private and the public. I mean, that's really where most of the big battles are being fought out. So I would say that at the moment, the other side, and I'm using the other side because I cannot give it a name, but hopefully by the end of this weekend we can give it a name. I got a few ideas, but I'm not going to mention it just yet. The other side has not yet crystallized into an alternative, but it is sufficiently powerful to neutralize previous standards and conventions. I mean, I'm just astounded by that. That virtually there's nothing you can any longer take for granted. When you get to the point where you go to a toilet, right, and you kind of, hanging out at the urinal and you find all these weird people sharing your private space in a toilet, something new has happened. And not only that, but they think they got a high moral, oh, look at that guy. He's just a man, sort of, whereas I'm much more than that. So when you got that kind of cultural shift occurring in a very short period of time, you'll know that there's no convention. There's no previous convention you can take for granted. There's a paradox in the culture war, which is that the constant expression of culture actually depletes it of any meaning. In the English language now, we have this habit of talking about institutional culture, sort of group culture. We talk about kind of corporate culture. I mean, everything is kind of a culture, to the point at which we use culture so much that its association with cultivation, with what culture used to mean originally, is pretty much sort of lost sight of. And that wouldn't be a problem, except for the fact that the more you, in a sense, empty culture of its meaning, what you're then doing is you're creating the conditions where culture, which is something that is organically created, has got some organic basis to the past, that kind of culture is displaced by the creation of values which are done technically and administratively. So all the new values in our society are not based upon human experience over centuries. They are artificially created, and they come out of nowhere. All of a sudden you have diversity as being a principal value. All of a sudden you have difference as being very highly valued. All of a sudden you have safety as being incredibly valuable. One morning you wake up and you discover that one of the most important values in our globe is sustainability. I mean, where did that come from? Today we use sustainability almost without thinking. They say, oh yeah, it's a really important value. But where does that come from? And all these things are essentially technical and administratively created kind of values. So these are values, I think, that are, in a sense, quite powerful, albeit of temporary influence. But the good news is that none of these values can speak for themselves. Right? The good news is that none of the values, when you actually ask people to explain what diversity is, they end up by saying that they don't like homogeneity. Right? They don't like people who are homogeneous. We like diversity. It's kind of, a kind of very childish kind of concept. We like difference. Well, why do you value difference? What's the good thing about difference? And when you demand that this should be explained to you, they're not very good at providing a proper account. And all the values that have been created, basically, what the good news is they both lack meaning, but more importantly, they all lack moral depth. Right? All of these kind of artificially created values that are in the value statements of different organizations, they all, without exception, lack moral depth. They haven't got the capacity to move the spirit, the human spirit, in the way that the kind of the norms that have emerged over the centuries have been kind of created. So where does that leave us? I mean, I don't want to anticipate the discussion later on, because we'll look at particularly the present moment tomorrow. But it seems to me that where that leaves us is that we need to, in a sense, counter this by elaborating in a very aggressive kind of way, in-your-face kind of a way, a humanist alternative, one that values and assigns a central role to judgment, which Angus mentioned. I think judgment is key here. Judgment, as we'll also discuss tomorrow, is the key way in which you can reintroduce a moral sensibility that can match, more than match, what it is that one is fighting, that can reintroduce the idea of individual sovereignty and autonomy, which I think is absolutely crucial. I think, sadly, at the moment, individual autonomy is being fought by the two dominant sides in the culture war, because both the conservative side and the anti-conservative side don't like individual autonomy. They think that somehow that negates the idea of community. They don't realize that unless you have individuals who are autonomous, able to exercise their autonomy and take responsibility for their action, unless you have that, we're going to have a lot of problems. And I think we have to also take seriously the values of responsibility and duty. I think really important that we basically reintroduce the concept that we have to take responsibility for our action, and that has got a very real meaning from the way we raise children all the way through our lives. And duty, which is seen as being like an old-fashioned, crazy kind of a word, is really quite important, because unless we have duties to one another and duties to society, it's not really possible to create a kind of a framework of meaning through which these kinds of concepts can be fought. I think finally the key point, and this is something that I'm struggling with, is we have to always remember, time and time again, that they are very, very effective at silencing us. And when I think of myself and the amount of energy I've spent over the years in trying to tactically get around to avoid being called this or being called that, I've come to the conclusion of saying, well, we now reached a critical moment, and if I see something that I think is morally reprehensible, if I think that I see something that is fundamentally flawed, regardless of provoking a reaction and being called a homophobe or a dysphobe or whatever, I think you just got to say it. And I think we have to go on the offensive and basically get them to go on the defensive and understand that they're being childish in the way that you just hurl words at us. I think getting that voice back is going to be a difficult challenge, because even people, even sensible, intelligent people, have almost learned the art of self-censorship over the years. And when you've been socialized into the art of self-censorship, it's really very difficult to go out in public. Not in this room, because in this room we can be very brave, talking to each other, but to go out there is a little bit more difficult. I think that seems to me the key challenge. And I'm absolutely convinced that if you dare say what the score is, and you dare challenge these views, you'll find that it will resonate with a lot more people than you imagine. I think that's one of the nice things that's come out of politics in Britain, certainly in the UK, in the last couple of years, that there are a lot more people there who want their voices to be represented, and they want a system of meaning through which they can somehow discover their braveness, their capacity to be citizens in our society. So yes, let's go and fight.
Okay, thank you, Frank. Who'd like to? Lots of people, apparently. Right, we've got a couple of mics. Should we start up there on the right-hand side, gentleman with the blue and white striped T-shirt, and then the other mic at the back on the left? Yes, Toby.
Yeah. Thanks for that, Frank. It was a very interesting lecture. I'd like maybe just to ask you to elaborate on one thing, and then I've got a question. You introduced two types of culture war, and you used World War I as the distinguishing point, and you said that culture wars prior to World War I were a sublimated form, I'm paraphrasing slightly, of anterior secular conflicts, which gave them a sort of weight and meaning. Could you just explain a little bit as to how the culture wars after World War I differ from being that sublimated form of wider secular conflicts? Are you saying that at that point ideological conflict became free-floating, didn't represent anything from outside of itself? So just a sort of clarification on that. And then maybe on the contemporary period, we might pick this up at another time, but are you describing a totalizing social process? Because you would have thought there'd be exceptions to that rule, and then which might help sort of test the thesis. You know, in which circumstances doesn't this apply, or which contexts, or in which parts of the world doesn't this apply, that ideological conflicts have this free-floating character? I mean, you know, you could think about, I don't know, Iran as an example. Would you include Iran as part of this process, or China, or India? Just wondering where in contemporary society does it not apply? Because that might be interesting to explore, and that might be areas for potential allies.
Iran. An important storm. Yeah.
Hi, Frank. Thank you. A question that I cannot understand is that there seems to be happening something weird. These people are at the same time very fanatical and very censorious, but at the same time, they're very unsure about their ideas. For example, I had a colleague who dared to challenge the definition of transgenderism to an HR department in a university, and he found layer after layer after layer of bureaucrats who could not give him an answer, and the final answer is, well, we go according to that definition of that policy body. So I could imagine these people, for example, in a different era, having completely different ideas, maybe being, I don't know, for white supremacy or patriarchy, because these were the dominant ideas of the time. So my question is, how can you explain this contradiction, that these people who lack this moral depth or this deep understanding in their beliefs are so prominent in these culture wars? And also a comment, I think that the fact that the other side is empty cells means that if we lose this culture war, the joke is on us.
Thank you. So if you could pass it down towards the middle, and the other mic down here at the front.
All right. Well, thank you very much,
start
Frank.
There, and then lady here at the front.
Okay. I'm kind of trying to grapple with the idea of why this whole thing is playing itself out so much in America. I mean, you said it's not only America, but you do say that most of the horrible things have come from America. And now I've read Alan Bloom, who's on our reading list, and he actually makes the interesting point you made about McCarthyism too, saying he had no influence on the campuses. But he blames, or he relates this whole thing back to Germany, not to America, saying it's actually a Nietzschean turn which we've been sort of observing. So Nietzsche being one of the first to, if you want to put it that way, look at the whole void or the emptiness of capitalist rhetoric of his time. And I was wondering what you make of that argument, saying it's not actually American, it's actually, of course, as always, German. Thank you.
Guilty conscience speaking to the lady here.
I just wanted to ask how you factor in the whole movement and development of mental health. Obviously, the counterculture, there was a kind of sense of counselling and I need to look inside myself and all of that. But obviously, it's a really strong thing, and the whole discussion of well-being, which I'm sure we'll talk about tomorrow, but how did that develop? And for me as well, one of the things that's very difficult and is moving down to primary schools is the culture that children are growing up in, where, you know, transgenderism and suicide and all those things. And as a Year 6 teacher, I've had to deal with that this year. And we've had to sort of say to the child concerned, we can't accommodate you because how do we explain it to 4-year-olds? You know, in a primary school, these sorts of things become very difficult for very younger children. But I mean, I understand the question of autonomy and how children come to the fore as a way of adults avoiding their autonomy. But how did that development of the kind of inability of adults to take, maybe you've answered it by saying we're attacking the past, but that inability to provide a framework for children and actually the way that children are now leading. And as just quickly on, as a primary school teacher, the culture is coming into the classroom via the children, and it's very difficult to be brave as a teacher in that situation.
Frank, do you want to comment quickly on that?
On what?
Or anything you'd like to comment quickly on?
Yeah, I think that the way to understand the kind of the fanatical, you know, sort of determination. I mean, it is very disturbing the way that people are attacked and the extreme language that is used. To me, it's a symptom of the fact that you got, and this is something I like to explore in detail tomorrow. You got this coexistence of non-judgmentalism, right? Where everything is relative, nothing is being judged. You know, every family is the same, no matter what. Every relation is the same, no matter what. But at the same time, that non-judgmentalism coexists with judgment. Because, you know, the people that say, we're non-judgmental are very free with their judgmental words against the people that they don't like. They don't hold back. And they say, oh yeah, homophobic, yeah, I can understand. It's an interesting idea. You know, sort of don't say, you know, xenophobic, yeah, well, that's cool. You know, they're the very opposite to that. And I think that the way to understand that is that they basically are non-judgmental, except for when it comes to the moral standards and the moral hierarchy that preceded them. So when you look at their judgment, you know, the hostility that they kind of hurl at people, it's all targeting the moral standards and the moral hierarchy that prevailed. And the thing that you have to really understand is that every single one of these identity groups, whether they know it or not, whether they're conscious or unconscious, are trying to reverse the hierarchy so that they do to the people that they don't like what they feel has been done to them, right? So that, you know, you basically, you know, if you're, you know, like in San Francisco and you're a gay activist and you want to basically introduce gay marriage, you know, sort of and kind of live the life, that's good. But that's what you're also interested in doing, and somebody mentioned this to me the other day, is messing up heterosexual marriage, because you know that's what's going to come out of that. There's a kind of impulse to, you know, hurl back at something. And I think within society there is a kind of corrosiveness somebody asked a question about, sort of what's different about the kind of culture war that begins to occur. If you look at and why and what's happening internally to us, if you look at the Roman Empire, the elites had also lost their nerves. We all know that. They also stopped believing in their old way of life. Many of them turned to Christianity as it turned, which wasn't very good for the empire, as we later discovered. And basically, you had this kind of corrosion from within the Roman society. But unlike today, when the Roman society did that, there were the barbarians who could get rid of them, and they could basically give an alternative and destroy Rome, right? The fall of Rome. Whereas today, what we've got is we've got an equally kind of corrosive, internally kind of corrosive process. But we haven't yet got the barbarians outside the gate, and because they're all inside, right? And because they're inside, their impact upon existing culture is very, very different than what would have been the case in the past. I don't want to talk about mental health because I'm talking a lot about it tomorrow. But I just want to say something about America, which is very curious. Why did this begin there? And I think it happened in America because America was in a very lucky position of having a strong sense of foundation of Americanness. America had a kind of confidence within itself that was very unusual in the 19th century and the early 20th century. And I think because of that, America was much more open to the idea of political experimentation, and at a very early stage came to rely upon social engineering as a way of governing society. I think it's in America that you have the first mass introduction of expertise, the first mass introduction of new ways of doing things. And in the course of that, what you had was the experts, the new experts and new policymakers legitimated their position by basically distancing themselves from the old ways of doing things. And you can see this most clearly in education, where, and you can see this most clearly that in America, the most important discipline that emerges amongst policymakers and educators is, guess what? It's psychology, right? So pedagogy, which used to be a domain of philosophy and theology, is now run by psychologists. And I think once you begin to do that, that's really the kind of the background to the American crisis.
Okay, so got a gentleman here at the front and behind you. Actually, yes, if you've got the mic. And can people keep their hands up so I can? We've got, gosh, lots.
Hi, well, fantastic talk. Thanks a lot. I have a comment first. So this kind of new hegemony, without name, and I agree it might not have a name, is I want to add, is becoming very pernicious and it delivers some kind of economic stagnation. I feel that as a leader of a large business trying to do high performance, excellent work, and that becomes increasingly impossible. You can't make any demands on anybody. This non-judgmentalism is pervading here. It's also pervading the discipline in architecture and urban theory where you can't say certain things, and I've been recently de-invited from a keynote speech because other speakers thought it was untenable that I would be speaking. So it is hampering disciplinary progress, but hampering business very, very strongly. At the same time, I think this non-judgmentalism, as you said, what is really extirpated and vilified is actually trying still to place judgment. Make distinctions, talk about a superiority of a position versus another. That's what's the shock and the violation. And what we then feel is literally ad hominem vilification, because you can't make these arguments. And but I wanted to ask a question as well. And that is, there is of course a strong resistance flourishing on many levels to this. On the political scene and I'm not necessarily like the political end of the things, the particulars, but we have to look at Pegida, AfD in Germany, for instance.
Could you, hang on, your mic turned off. Yep.
Sorry. So I wanted to hear what you have to say about those movements and certain intellectuals who were highly prominent, whether we look at Jordan Peterson was mentioned, Bill Maher, and Culture, Steve Bannon, Sam Harris. Some of them have been extremely vilified and I think horribly misrepresented and defamed. But there are these figures and there are these movements. So isn't there the hegemony? It might be highly fragile.
Could you pass the mic back to the gentleman wearing a shirt like mine, I think? Yep, and the other one to gentleman in the black T-shirt.
I wanted to ask on the introduction that if you say culture wars, it kind of suggests to me stand above that. Whereas I wonder if in the conversation it's a bit more like get stuck in to the culture wars. Because as you were telling it, which I'm not arguing with, but you said most of the kind of movement was on the counterculture side. But that meant that you didn't spend much time thinking about the conservative side in the culture wars. I'm thinking of, all those people like William Bennett, and Alan Bloom. And there must have been something wrong with the conservative arguments that they so consistently failed. As we're adopting a critical aspect towards a counterculture, is that what's the flaws in the conservative response to the counterculture that suggests that they keep losing, or is there a reason why they keep losing? And so is our message that there's something beyond the two positions, or is it, conservatives redouble your efforts? So,
if you could pass the mic to Luke just in front of you, James, just in front of you, Luke, and then, yeah. Go on.
Thanks. You mentioned the two phrases.
Hang on.
Oh, sorry.
Order.
Sorry. Just on the question of intersectionality, obviously the case in Birmingham is a very natural point for our discussion today, but is this genuinely a point at which the ideas of identity politics have run into an inevitable contradiction? Is there something in it which is inviting a system of non-judgmentalism to actually make a judgment? And should the growth of intersectionality in a bizarre way almost be welcomed? Is this I hate to say the cunning of reason, but is this a trap door in this present system that's actually opening itself up? Could it eat itself?
Okay, interesting question. Luke, and then if you could, yes, just in front of you. Yeah, perfect.
Yes, so you mentioned the two phases of the culture war initially from 1940.
Luke,
yeah.
So could you stand up, sort of use the mic? Can't hear you.
That's all right. So the two phases of the culture war, initially the ascendancy of the counterculture and then the institutionalization of the counterculture. Could you explain a little bit about how the rise of new institutions, particularly in that period, might complicate that picture a little bit? So I'm thinking of the rise of the United Nations, the League of Nations, the European Union, all of which actually appeal to rather conservative modes of authority. So the United Nations saw themselves as appealing to traditional notions of human dignity. The European Union attempts to constitute authority through an appeal to sort of Christendom and the European and something common amongst European elites. And the way I've always understood that is it's a way of sort of attempting to reconstitute moral authority through a kind of legalistic, technocratic framework. And it gives rise to new forms of, or attempts by these institutions to reconstitute legitimacy in forms which are divorced from the democratic populist. I just want to agree or not.
Yeah, no, thank you. Bring Frank back in now, and then we'll start back now. Let's see.
Yeah, I totally agree with you, and I think that's a very big problem because conservatism in the post-war period hid behind juridification, and they relied entirely on legal instruments as a way of compensating for your inability to give meaning to Christianity or to give meaning to a variety of things. So precisely as Vatican II is happening, and every old school religious person is marginalized, and you have this new guys coming through, they kind of putting all their energies into sort of what kind of new NGO, international NGO we can have to sort of stabilize us. And they didn't realize, this is one of the fatal flaws of conservatism, they didn't realize that conservative ideology depends, if it's real conservatism, on the maintenance of some kind of organic link with the past. I mean, it's natural law. It's basically a morality that's based upon centuries of human endeavor. And if you marginalize that, then conservatism becomes merely an affectation, rather than something that has got any political thing. And that relates to the point. Why did the conservatives prove to be so singularly unsuccessful in the culture war? Because they did fight back in the 70s. You had the black paper in England. You had, as you said, Bennett and the neocons. And some of the writings are really good. I mean, Jean Kirkpatrick, I think, is a really good writer. Irving Kristol in the old days really saw very clearly what was really going on. But I think the fatal flaw of conservatism was that they had, in a sense, they couldn't make up their minds whether they were going to be traditionalist, hold on to the tradition, or to try to somehow modernize themselves. And they opted for modernizing themselves. And that was the problem that they had. They then became detached from their own past. And in that sense, what you had was a conservatism that, I would call it a conservatism with bad faith, where they outwardly fought for family values, whilst at the same time, their practice was just almost the very opposite. I think that's particularly the case in the British establishment. Which then leads me to the most difficult question, which was asked here in the front, about how do we relate to all these diverse characters? And I'm struggling with that because I've been going around Europe recently, and I've been meeting AFD guys in Berlin, and I've been meeting all kinds of individuals who I disagree with politically on quite a lot of things. But a lot of them I really like. I like Thierry Baudet, for example, even though I don't agree with a lot of his stuff. What I really like about them is that they can see certain things. And I think what they've done is, by being on the margins of the world, that gives you a clarity about some of the problems that you're kind of confronted with. It gives you a perspective. The unfortunate thing is that all these people in La Lega or in various organizations have carried with them that baggage, that Cold War baggage from the past. And they don't really understand the complicity of their way of life in creating what has gone on. They think that somehow it's this cultural Marxist or some deus ex machina that has introduced this, rather than understanding that it's their own tradition that has created the mess that they're in. And that's why someone like Jordan Peterson is very limited, because he can basically react against when he's being attacked and everything else. But then when he tries to fall back on this kind of almost like self-help form of Christianity, that American, vulgar form of Christianity, then you do end up becoming a caricature of yourself. And I was horrified because I was in Budapest a few months ago, and I invited all these people to see, Peterson speak. Because doing a big rally outdoors, there were thousands of people there. It was a huge, and he started speaking. It was an embarrassment, right? He kind of came across as a third-rate Jesus, kind of crying, and ended up giving therapy to people, inviting people to come in. What's your problem? And I'll give you the. And it was, the Hungarians there were saying, well, if this is what you got in America, you can have it. And I think there are real limits. But having said that, I've come to the conclusion that I'm open to anybody, who is prepared to be temporary allies in this, because, whether we like it or not, the battlegrounds are not drawn by us, and this is not the conflict of our own making, and we do need to use whatever influence and resources one can have to kind of contain it. But it's a very difficult question, and it goes back to conservatism. I'm sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night, and I say to myself, well, maybe what I should do is write a book on conservatism which helps conservatives to be real conservatives. Rather than the third-rate kind of stuff. Maybe they need my help because they're not really doing it at the moment. And there are a lot of experiments by conservatives in America. There's a guy called Dreher who decides that the way you bring conservatism back is by setting up little Catholic abbeys in Italy. Benedictine, it's called the Benedict option, and you kind of set up, you kind of go away, and hopefully when you return to reality, Jesus will have, made it better. So there is the attempts that they're trying to kind of evolve are very sad at the moment, and having got the ability, which I can understand, to actually say, well, we've got to go back to step one. And that's a problem, because even though I'm not a conservative, it'd be good if there was, a few real conservatives around.
So, lots of hands still up, so they're going to have to be slightly briefer points. Just encapsulate it so we can get, I hope, all of you in, and then bring Frank back at the end, because we've got, 20 minutes. So here, and then if you pass, Red, and then pass to the gentleman on the side.
Frank, I have a question on the. I want to go back to the silencing things, because it's not as if it was like everybody could have a voice before and then suddenly we are all silenced. So there is something different about it. And and in the beginning, I was thinking that the silences of the voice, the ordinary people, was due to the fact that there is no institutions, the working class institutions and ordinary people institutions are gone. But I think there's more than that. I mean, I'm being called a racial traitor on one side, or an identity politics on the other side. So the silencing comes from a lot of people, and I just think it's something that is much wider than the identity politics cry that we're always complaining about, but come from the idea that the lack of belief of individual autonomy. Because when you discuss any issue, FGM or racial things, there is always this belief that an individual cannot have a point of view. So I cannot have a point of view as a black person on one side, I cannot have a point of view on the other side also. So I just think that the silencing is something completely new. I just don't want to, I don't agree that there was no silencing before. I just think that there's something completely new, and it's the underlying idea so that individuals cannot have a point of view. That's what prevents silencing, and the silencing comes from different groups of people. And I'm getting tired of all these identity politics people are silencing, because I think we are silenced by different sides at the moment.
So if you pass, this.
Sorry,
yes, that way, sorry.
Sorry. That's right. Very quickly, like you, Frank, I'm always reluctant to look for external influences on this. I take the point that it's the development of this conservative collapse has been internal to conservatism. I'm struck by your reference to the 70s. It's the most hateful decade, in my view. Do you think that the Vietnam War and the recession and the energy crisis of the early 70s contributed to the loss of confidence of the bourgeoisie in their own culture and their own values? Or is that too glib?
If you could pass it down to the front here, lady, here, right at the front. Keep passing it down until
Can I just ask my
pass
question?
no further. It'll come back to you afterwards. It'll one more.
Very
one
quick.
more. Lady in front of you, and then we'll go back. Yep, got it.
I'm being privileged, it's white privilege. I just wondered, why is that you situate yourself or ourselves outside of this? So if the two sides in the culture, or if you like, are kind of have sort of floated, unless they're floated free from any kind of material interest or groups of power, why can't there be a third way? Why is it that you feel the need to kind of shore up one side or the other? Why can't there be an alternative?
And that's behind you, gentleman there. Yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to be a little bit more precise about where capitalism fits into all of this, because you're, I think, entirely right on the point that it emerges from the sort of moral depletion of capitalism and its inability to articulate values. But one of the things that I find quite distinctive now is how the sort of these adversary culture ideas are a way of contemporary capitalist elites shoring up their authority. They provide a new language for this elite to articulate itself on the one hand, and then at the economic level, it also provides the perfect basis for continuing capitalist inroads into the family, into sell products, and all of the things that you would notice is about you could buy identities now. And so I'd just like a little bit more information on precisely how capitalism sort of fits into this.
If you could pass the mic along the road to that gentleman there. And the lady in blue. Yes. Lady in blue.
Very quick question. You suggested that we dare say out loud what we really think. Do you think there are fundamental aspects to life this century compared to last century that just make us less brave to do that?
And if you buzz it to the gentleman behind you, Kevin.
Just a question on generations, because I think if you gave that speech in front of all 50-year-olds, Frank, I think everybody would be nodding along. But in my experience, a younger generation is much less, doesn't get it in the same way. Is that just accumulated experience? What is that about? Can you incorporate the generational divide into that?
Do you want to come back at any point or wait till the end? Yeah.
I'll come back later, but give me some more time. Yeah. Yes.
Hi there, yeah, thanks first of all for a really good talk. I found it really interesting. Couple of things. Firstly, on the cultural Marxism, I think you're right in one sense that it is kind of nonsensical, kind of in a philosophical sense, and especially related to capitalism. But on the other hand, I see that the identity politics crowd now, the progressive liberal left, they have taken on that style of politics. They basically transferred the idea of the favoured group as being the proletariat that's going to take over to these new groups, to non-white people, to women, to LGBT, etc. So I think there is some truth in it politically, in how the politics works, and how these political movements have just kind of sidestepped to sort of do the same type of politics in a different way. The other thing was, I thought a really interesting point on language, and the way that these people, they won't allow themselves to be defined and spoken about in language, that they're elusive about it. But at the same time, they do speak about themselves as a we and an us. I was looking at a video with Louis Theroux and a load of comedians the other day, and they were talking about Trump and Brexit as something that needs to be fought, as a we need to do it. So there is a definite group there.
Yep, no, thank you. So Dennis and then Alka on that side. And
can it be that insignificant, or that the rise of this identity politics is paralleled by the kind of decline of Western capitalism from the First World War, the Depression,
the mic sort of echoing.
the Second World War, and all that's happened since. So there is a direct parallel between the rise of this particular this identity politics and capitalism's kind of failure. I was just reading a book the other day where I was noting in England where Lady Chatterley's lover in 1959, the liberal elite felt really capable of defending it and the right of the author to publish and so on. But by 1990, with Salman Rushdie's Satanic Verses, that had gone. And so they were linking it to British imperial decline, if you're saying that was the most significant aspect in relation to why the liberal elites had lost their confidence. But when you put the emphasis on moral authority, it seems to me that it's very difficult to find a way to argue against these people without having some moral authority of your own. So, what could that possibly be? Young people, to me, it seems, experienced contemporary identity politics as a very positive thing. They see it as, adding to the nature of the freedom of the human individual in most respects. I mean, even in Ireland, where the same-sex marriage referendum and all those things, people experience it as a great freedom that has been delivered to them. And similarly, across Europe, they talk in those terms. So, I mean, in coming up with a way of fighting this and arguing against it, where do you find your moral authority to counter these kind of ideas?
Okay, if you go to Alka in front of you there, and then I've got a hand on the back right on this side.
Clearly we need a shop for moral authority where we can go and get some. Sorry, that was just I think it touches on the question Kevin raised about the generational divide, because I think the response to this from young people is more differentiated. I don't think it is just all of a block. But I think we do need to then look at the thing that you touched on, Frank, when you were talking about the need to get status in the symbolic field, which is obviously the role of education. And then you've got looked sociologically what has happened to the role of education, the predominance it's come to play as a site for arbitrating and a gatekeeper in wider public morals and norms. And then also what's happened internally within higher education. Because the whole, for example, the thing that I've been looking at for quite a while, as people will know, the decolonising stuff, is that the thing about it is that it really does, it's not just about, as you were saying, it's not just about turning the faces at the top table into black faces rather than white faces, although that is a large part of it. But it is really about changing the whole criteria by which you get status, the intellectual apparatus per se. So it's about changing the disciplinary procedures by which people get to enter a particular field and gain status at that site, and also the methodological standards and criteria, where we see rational modes of inquiry being delegitimized and experiential knowledge being supported. And that, of course, creates this kind of new, very emotional character and persona that's taken up. So there's...
just quickly.
Okay, just very quickly, what I wanted to ask, I've been thinking also of the Gramsci thing of hegemony and whether we're in an interregnum and whether it's the idea of the new can't be born, so we have a morbid symptom. So is this a kind of morbid symptom? But also I wonder, you can't really have something not being born. You can't have a vacuum. So what is happening now? Is it the start of something new, or is it the end, or is it just a mess of neither?
We're waiting for the barbarians, I think, too. Yeah. So on this side, I'm going to take John Holbrook, then Alan Miller at the back. But first of all, on the left-hand side there. Yeah.
Steve Moxon. This idea there's been a crisis of confidence, yes. Dates from the First World War, yes. Everything else about the analysis, I think, is fundamentally wrong. Clearly, there's the idea there's a crisis of confidence in commerce, in capitalism, as you term it, which is not an entity, it's not genetic, is laughable. There's certainly no crisis there. The crisis, as you say, is in the left intelligentsia. It dates from World War I because that's when you had a Marxist revolution amongst serfs in Russia, but no predicted revolution amongst workers in the West. So the left project, ever since then, for the last century, has been demonising workers. That's what identity politics is. And Frank knows this history, surely fully well, the Frankfurt School, etc. Marxist European intellectuals thought, why is it that the Western workers are not revolting? They've been repressed. These bogus Freudian terms they borrowed. And they took up an idea from Engels, yes, the workers are repressing the family, or the family's repressing them. They took that to the States. Then the new left in the 60s, they look at where can we see a proto-Marxist revolution? Civil rights. Stonewall. So lo and behold, circa 1970, you got this triumvirate of victim groups of women, ethnic minorities, and non-heterosexuals. And that's where all this rubbish comes from. We don't know about, we don't feel it now because it's been a century in the making. It's the backlash by the left against the workers. It's hatred, pure and simple. And Frank is an apologist for this.
John and Alan, and then we'll see where we are, but do make quick points.
Frank, when you said that a key battleground is sovereignty, I thought, oh great, Frank's going to talk up the nation as being a collective institution that can bind people together behind a shared sense of ideas, norms and values. But sadly, you then disclaimed the notion of the sovereign nation in favour of talking about the sovereignty of the individual. And then you came back to that right towards the end when you talked about individual autonomy. And you said the problem with conservatives is that they see individual autonomy as antagonistic towards any sort of collective sense of identity. Now, what troubles me about this is that obviously autonomy is important in the sense that you need brave, courageous individuals to fight for things. But my question is always, what is it that they should be fighting for? And that's where I think the reason why the culture war is always going in the same direction is because collective institutions no longer get a look in. Nearly every debate that we have in this country now is about how far should we go in recognising someone's individual rights. And that's not the debate we need to have, because that's only ever going to go in the wrong direction. What we need to look at is what are the collective interests which are being challenged by this constant narrative of individual rights. Now, I just asked you, Frank, is there anything in my analysis? Do you share it? Because it does trouble me that by constantly talking up the sovereignty of the individual and autonomy in the way that you do it, and by neglecting the things I think we need to talk more about, I think you are giving far too much ground to the people who are currently winning the culture war.
I think so. Yep.
You did sweepingly say that the corrosion that is existing there's also a lack of any doctrinaire challenge. And I wonder, it seems like if it's an attempt to racialize everything, and if there's an attack on tradition and the past, that does seem somewhat doctrinaire. Maybe I'm not understanding that properly. And that leads to, you know, something that made a big impact on me. You said at the end, where you're saying that all these ideas around difference and diversity and sustainability all lack any moral depth. And then you went on to finish on saying you need to take responsibility and accountability to your duty to step up, but it's difficult to make the case that they lack any moral depth. Even if someone who's much younger or indeed over 50 says, well, I'm a humanist, I believe that this thing is important, that actually historically the question of difference was negated, or that, yeah, perhaps we need a world in order to have humanity. They don't seem to lack any moral depth whatsoever. So could you clarify what you mean by that, please?
All right, we're going to squeeze one more in, back in black, at the back. And then Frank.
Frank, could you put a bit more flesh on the idea of duty? Because I share John's sort of difficulty in negotiating the relationship between the individual and shared values, not collectivity or shared values. I mean, I meet a lot of young men that are into Peterson, and the one thing that they're really into is not just the anti-PC stuff, but the lobster metaphor, you know, that there's a sort of biological essentialism that drives us all, where we only have duty to ourselves. So that's coming from one side, but I also meet a lot of people on the non-woke left, which I think you haven't talked about so much in America. You can see the sort of emergence of the non-woke left. And they're kind of really pushing the individualizing experience of capital at the moment in terms of the experience of the working class and the black working class in the US and in Britain. And it kind of sings along with our own experience of how atomizing life appears to be. So I'm just interested whether duty is a mechanism through which we can kind of challenge Peterson's ideas, but perhaps it's the best mechanism to challenge the ideas of the non-woke left as well.
Okay, sorry, apologies to people I wasn't able to take, but there'll be lots more chances later on. Frank, your thoughts before we go to lunch?
Yeah, well, I don't know where to begin. I think on John's point, as it happens, I'm writing a book in defense of national sovereignty at the moment, so it's not a million miles away from my concern. I think where I disagree with you is you seem to use the term individual rights and individual autonomy interchangeably. And they're two different things. You know, individual autonomy does not depend on, you know, sort of on begging for rights or politicizing rights. The exercise of individual autonomy is a much more fundamental way in which human subjectivity flourishes, you know, through actions that are in line with your inclinations, and you take responsibility for those actions. And I really agree with this lady in the blue here about courage. And the fact that we lost that courage, I think that's to do with socialization, where instead of socializing young people to be courageous, we socialize them into values that are the very opposite of that. And where risk-taking and loyalty and duty, all these other, you know, important values are kind of made fun of, or are seen as impossible, macho kind of values and everything. And in many respects, a lot of the question that people ask, well, how do you fight back? Where do you begin? I think the key area is education. I don't think you can avoid education, because generation after generation of young people are being socialized, not just in schools, but now half the young people are being taught all this horrible stuff at universities. It's more than 50%. So when you have that, unless you're able to effectively offer counter alternatives to the ideas that are being taught there, it's very difficult to do that. And I think that education is a very important battleground. I think socialization is a key area. And that needs to be kind of looked at and understood the way it kind of works itself out. People are asking this question about capitalism. I mean, I don't understand the questions exactly, because in many respects, what's happening today is really corrosive of capitalism itself. I mean, if you, as the guy, as you were saying, if you're running a business and you can't fire somebody, because you're going to sort of break all kinds of human resources rules. If you have a workplace situation where you cannot discipline people or have high expectations of them, because it's against their nature, then I think you end up with Google, and it might make a lot of money. When you go inside Google, there are biologically mature people behaving like children, kind of playing with themselves, sort of, and that's the kind of symbolic workplace kind of situation that you create. I like what the guy said in the back about the responsibility of people like me and Marxism and for what's really going on. But I do think that if you attend to history, you'll find that at a very early point, the elites of Britain and America, without being converted to Marxism, began to lose faith in themselves. I mean, if you don't believe me, read the editorial of the London Times the day that Malaysia fell. And when they begin to talk about what's happening to our empire, what's happening to our way of life, if you look at the way in which the university system in Cambridge and Oxford, all the elite institutions, almost voluntarily gave up on themselves, the way that the capitalist class in the contemporary era, without very much trade union working class pressure, just embraces all these ideas and institutionalizes them to the point at which they almost become caricatures of themselves. I think in many respects, the idea of blaming the cultural Marxist or the idea that somehow what these people are doing is anything like what Marxists used to do relies upon a very far-stretched metaphor. Because I think if all that one is saying is that you're looking for heroes, I think every movement has their heroes, and for Marx it was the working class. Today it's the identity groups. The latest group that's the big hero are the refugees. So that kind of confuses matters. I think we have to look within the system, understand what that basic kind of dynamic is, because unless we do that, then we're not going to understand why it is that there is this kind of drive, this kind of relentless drive within us. I think moral authority can be gained by fighting for the values that we think are really important. I think courage is really key. I think loyalty, I think duty, I think responsibility, solidarity. I mean, all these are really important values that we need to sing about all the time. And I agree with you that silencing occurs all the time. But the silencing that occurs now is a little bit different, because the silencing is not something that is driven by a particular state system. It's not the police force, although they now begin to do that as well. That's kind of silencing us. I think it's much more to do with the way that culture has occurred. And as we'll discuss tomorrow, one of the reasons why silencing is so important is because the main accomplishment of their side is to dominate language. Right? I think that they've been extremely successful in telling us what are the words that we can use, what are the words that we can no longer use. When you look at the number of words, you have D words, you have N words, you have H. I mean, the entire alphabet now has got words that you can no longer use. And I think that has not been noticed. That and Orwell has told us a long time ago that one of the easiest way of taking away our freedom, is by controlling our language. And I think that has happened. And we have got to do something about it, because we got to do to them what they did to us. But, like this, rather than anything.